Well, this morning, CNN's Christiane Amanpour just had an exclusive one-on-one sit-down with former President Barack Obama. The two are in Athens, Greece, the birthplace of democracy, and had a very candid discussion. The war in Ukraine, the upcoming U.S. election, and how to navigate a global, very tricky relationships with autocratic leaders. Christiane will join us in a moment. But first, here's part of that conversation.
President Biden, a man who you know extremely well, has made the defense of democracy the sort of centerpiece of his administration. It just so happens that right now there's also not just, threats to democracy by dictatorships and autocrats, but also illiberal democracy as well. Yeah. He has called the president of China a dictator, and they're sticking with it. He is also hosting, as we speak, the Prime Minister of India, Modi, who is considered autocratic or at least illiberal Democrat. What is the point, I guess, or how should a president engage with those kinds of leaders, either in the naming of them or in the dealing with them?
Look, it's complicated. The president of the United States has a lot of equities. And when I was president, I would deal with figures, in some cases who were allies, who if you pressed me in private, do they run their governments and their political parties in ways that I would say are ideally democratic? I'd have to say no.
Do you want to name names?
No, of course not. But you had to do business with them because they're important for national security reasons. There are a range of economic interests. I dealt with China to get the Paris Accords done. I dealt with Modi to get the Paris Accords done, because I think climate change is something that transcends, any particular momentary issues. It's a problem that humanity's got to deal with over the next several decades in a serious way. I do think that it is appropriate for the President of the United States, where he or she can, to uphold those principles and to challenge, whether behind closed doors or in public, trends that are troubling. And so I'm less concerned about labels than I'm concerned about specific practices. I think it is important for the President of the United States to say that if you have Uyghurs in China who are being placed in mass camps and re-educated, quote unquote, that's a problem. That's a challenge to all of us, and we have to pay attention to it. I think it is true that if the president meets with Prime Minister Modi, then the protection of the Muslim minority in a majority Hindu India, that's something worth mentioning. Because, and by the way, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, who I know well, part of my argument would be that if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India, then there is a strong possibility India at some point starts pulling apart. And we've seen what happens when you start getting those kinds of large internal conflicts. So that would be contrary to the interests not just of Muslim India, but also Hindu India. So I think it's important to be able to talk about these things honestly. You're never going to have things are never going to be as clean as you'd like, right, because the world is complicated.
Well, Christiane likely join us later. She also has a special coming on the entirety of that interview later tonight, which I'm very much looking forward to. 10 p.m. Eastern, you see right there. Tune in for that. Right now, we want to bring in CNN political analyst, senior political correspondent at the New York Times, Maggie Haberman. Maggie, I want to talk about everything that you're deeply engaged in covering every single day, but just listening to that, I think the former president has certainly been more candid since he left office, but digging in on a very central issue to the current president, but also, I think, to some degree, the campaign coming up.
I think the campaign coming up, I think that, he was talking primarily about relations with foreign leaders, but realistically, it can apply to your point domestically, too. And I think that this is an argument that actually you haven't seen very many Democrats make about the pro-democracy efforts, which is that it's complicated, that it's not clean cut, it's not, it's not up and down always, and that sometimes you have to make decisions that are not necessarily in keeping with other professed ideals, but because there is a broader world out there. I do wonder how much we're going to see President Obama out there making arguments like this that supplement what President Biden has been saying. I mean, I think that there's always one of the concerns that Democrats have, particularly people around Joe Biden have, is that Obama is such a better communicator, such a more natural communicator, that is there going to be that inevitable comparison with Obama? I think it speaks to the moment we're in and the moment the Democrats find themselves in. I don't know how much of this Obama is discussing with the White House. I don't know how much of this is just him wanting to make his voice heard. But I do wonder if it portends hearing from him more going forward.
It's also just really interesting timing that he's doing this right after, as Christiane pointed out, Biden at that fundraiser in San Francisco, called Xi a dictator, and then the fact that he is hosting Modi. The White House, we should note, did get some concessions agreements. They're going to hold a joint press conference. That's a big deal. Modi didn't want to do that. He doesn't do that in India. So journalists will be able to ask him these hard questions, too. Do you think we'll hear from the White House whether or not President Biden brought up these many human rights concerns and treatment of journalists in India?
Yeah, I actually think that that's something that the White House will likely address. I think that they tend to be willing to engage on issues like that. I think that whether they're going to want to have a broader conversation about, to your point, the contradictions between, clearly outlining
in the same week.
In the same week, and when you're in such different circumstances, right? When you're hosting Modi in person. So, I do think this is going to be a contradiction they are going to get pushed on. Again, I think the point that Obama is making is that when you speak in absolutes, you are going to get questions like that, even if your commitment is absolute to democracy and to democracies globally, that we are living in a complicated world.
Maggie, stick with us, because we actually have Christiane Amanpour with us now. After that interview, we just heard a block of that interview, Christiane, and we're just talking about with Maggie how kind of fascinating it was and the dynamic and how candid the president was, former president was to some degree. What was your sense of things after talking to him?
Well, look, this is the question, right? President Biden has made defending democracy the centerpiece of his administration. Look at Ukraine, obviously the defense of democratic Ukraine. But as they say, it's complicated. There's realpolitik. You can go all the way back to Kissinger for that kind of, foreign policy of trying to maintain stability. I think what you're seeing, and you've probably already discussed this, many Democrats don't like this. They see that Modi is autocratic, that Modi is cracking down on the press, on religious minorities, the Muslim minority, on political opposition, and that is, autocratic, or at the very least, illiberal democracy. However, as you know, there is a very, very keen desire to try to win Modi over, to try to help him peel away from China. The entire focus, it looks like at the moment, of America's foreign policy is on China, and therefore they're trying to get as much support as they can, including they're trying to get India's support to bolster not the confrontation, but the idea of trying to make sure that China doesn't pose an even more dangerous threat. But again, it's risky, of course. Modi has not, and India has not gone ahead with many of the UN resolutions against Russia on this Ukraine war, keeps buying Russian oil. So there's a lot to be discussed between them.
Christiane, this is an exclusive interview. The fact that you got so much time with former President Obama in this moment, I was just saying to Phil, you're the perfect person to interview him in this moment. Can you give us a little bit of a highlight of what people will see tonight?
Yeah, well, it is an amazing time to get this interview because the former president is very, very, very much engaged in the promotion of global democracy and the strengthening of American democracy. He's here as part of his foundation with dozens, if not more than 100, what they call global youth leaders from his foundation, men and women, young men and women who they're trying to help really connect together and build and strengthen all the aspects of democracy from a grassroots up vision, if you like, around the world. And of course, here we are in Athens, the birthplace of modern democracy. So essentially, we talked about the US democracy, we talked about what he called creaky institutions around the world that need to be strengthened even in the US. I asked him about the spectacle of a former president who's been indicted on federal charges actually running for office, the highest office in the land, perhaps the world. And he said, of course, it's not ideal, but it is absolutely fundamental for Americans and others around the world to see that America upholds the rule of law and that the law applies to everybody. He said that was absolutely fundamental. And I'll say another thing, too. He spoke at length about global and U.S. inequality and inequity, income inequality and all the other inequalities that are so fundamental to the degradation of democracy in both the U.S. and around the world. And to be fair, and I'm just going to say it, he said, you know, the submarine, the submersible sinking, and we don't quite know what's going to happen, is a terrible tragedy. And yet, not enough, resources and attention was put on 750 poor people who were caught in the boat off the coast of Greece where we are right now, and who almost all have died except for maybe just over 100 people were saved. You know, these are the kinds of inequalities and all that goes with trying to rectify inequality that's going to be necessary in order to preserve democracy.